I know it's the cool thing to hate on defenses in fantasy, but guess what? A bunch of people play with them. So we're going to talk about, I'm going to give you my top 5 defenses to target this year and why you should wait until your last pick to take one. TFA fam, let's jump into the top fantasy defenses for the 2023 NFL season. But before we jump into that, I do want to go over just a little bit of strategy and why we always say to wait until the last pick for you to take your defense. And that same thing goes for kickers if you're playing with kickers as well. Those two should be the last two positions you take because there's so much more upside and there's so much more value if you can find one of these later guys to draft at running back or wide receiver. They become more valuable if those players hit versus a fantasy defense. Now, if you can find the fantasy defense number one for a particular season, that is valuable because on average, over the past 5 years, we've only had 1.4 defenses give you double-digit points. So basically, you're looking at 1-2 defenses any given year to give you double-digit points. That's not a lot, which is, again, why we say it's more valuable if you can find someone like last year who was going really late, Kenneth Walker, way more valuable to your team than a defense. The other thing is there's a ton of variance between defenses from year to year, just meaning that they are very difficult to figure out which defenses are going to be the ones who are giving you the most fantasy points at the end of the season. Over the past 5 years, there has been one defense that has been drafted as a top 5 defense to finish number 1 overall, and that was 2020 and the Steelers, and they were taken as the second defense off the board. They finished as a top defense. Other than that, last year, the Patriots were number 1. They were drafted as the 12th defense overall. 2021, that was the Cowboys. They were the 20th defense off the board. Like I said, the Steelers were first in 2020. In 2019, it was the Patriots again. They were the 6th defense off the board. And then in 2018, it was the Bears, and they were the 12th defense off the board. So again, it's really difficult to figure out which ones are going to be the top scoring defenses. We can figure out which ones for NFL purposes are going to be good. That doesn't necessarily translate into fantasy production, and that's all we care about here. So let's go ahead and jump into the top defenses you can get in the last round. I looked at Fantasy Pros ADP, and I'm looking at defenses that are going to be available in the 15th or 16th round of your drafts currently. So we're going to kick it off with the New Orleans Saints. Now, the reason why I like them a bunch this year for defensive purposes, they have one of the easiest schedules overall in the NFL. They have talented players on every level of defense. They spent their first 2 picks in the draft this year on the defensive line with tackle Brian Bosset and edge Isaiah Foskey. And they have a fantastic opening schedule. So they start off with Tennessee, Carolina, Green Bay, Tampa Bay, New England, and Houston through the first 6 weeks. None of those offenses scare me whatsoever. They are set up really well to have a great start for fantasy. Up next is the Jacksonville Jaguars. They finished as DST 7 last year, thanks to being top 5 in total turnovers and turnover rate. Even if those turnovers drop off this year, there's room for them to improve. They were 4th overall in pressure rate last year, but they were tied for the 7th fewest sacks overall. So even if those turnovers drop off a little bit, they can make up for that with some of the sacks, and they can also obviously keep some of the turnovers as well if they can convert those pressures into sacks. They have a pretty solid schedule through the first 6 weeks outside of 2 matchups. They have Kansas City in week 2 and Buffalo in week 5. But other than that, they get Indy twice, Houston, and Atlanta. The Cleveland Browns are the next defense I would be targeting for your fantasy football drafts in 2023. They dropped almost $100 million in free agency on their defense between Dalvin Tomlinson, Juan Thornhill, and Agbanya Okoronkwo. They also traded for Zadarius Smith. They just picked up Shelby Harris. They have a solid secondary that's led by Denzel Ward. 3 of their first 4 games are against AFC North opponents with Tennessee mixed in there. Opening against Cincy, that's their first game week 1. I mean, it's not great, but if Burrow isn't ready for week 1, that is going to be fantastic in that case. And although we're expecting Baltimore and Pittsburgh to have better offenses this year, typically divisional matchups tend to be lower scoring, so it's not that huge of a worry anyway. Up next is going to be the Detroit Lions. They were dreadful, absolutely dreadful against the pass last year, and they went in free agency and really tried to fix that. They added C.J. Gardner-Johnson, Cam Sutton, and Emmanuel Mosley to that secondary. Also spent a first-round pick on Jack Campbell, linebacker, and they spent a second-round pick on Brian Branch, who's already been making noise throughout training camp. Now, their first game opening up against Kansas City, obviously that is not ideal whatsoever, but after that, the schedule is pretty nice. They have Seattle, Atlanta, Green Bay, Carolina, and Tampa Bay through the first 6 weeks. Last but not least, let's talk about the Seattle Seahawks. They really revamped their defensive line by bringing in Draymond Jones and Jaron Reed. They drafted Devin Witherspoon in the first round to put him in the secondary. They took Derek Hall in the second round, and they also have some intriguing matchups the first few weeks. Now, again, their opening isn't that great, but it doesn't really worry me all that much either. They start off with the Rams and the Lions in the first 2 weeks, but then they get Carolina and the Giants after that before they hit their bye in week 5. So there's definitely worse defenses to look at. And let's say you're playing in a league where people are taking 2 defenses. Please do not do that. Do not take 2 defenses. Do not take 2 kickers. You really don't even need an extra tight end or a quarterback, honestly. We spend all those picks on running backs and wide receivers. But anyway, if you're in a league where people are taking 2 of these, all those names are gone. Some of the ones you can look at just based off of their matchups in the first 2 weeks, I really like the Denver Broncos. They open with Las Vegas and Washington. And then the Carolina Panthers would be the last one. They brought in Evero, who's really highly regarded defensive coordinator. They have talent all across that defense, and they open up with Atlanta and New Orleans. That is going to wrap it up. I appreciate you checking out the top fantasy defenses video. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments below. Please make sure to like and subscribe. You can also jump into our free fantasy football Discord. The link can be found in the description, and we'll talk to you on the next one.